Crystal skulls are carved objects made primarily of quartz crystal, shaped to resemble human skulls. Several examples surfaced in museums and private collections during the 19th century. The implication is ancient origin claims, while the limitation is that early documentation of their discovery is incomplete. The most famous crystal skulls were attributed to Mesoamerican civilizations, particularly the Maya and Aztec cultures. This attribution implies pre-Columbian craftsmanship. The limitation is that no authenticated archaeological excavation has ever recovered a crystal skull in situ. Quartz crystal is extremely hard, ranking 7 on the Mohs scale. This implies advanced carving techniques would be required. The limitation is uncertainty about whether such techniques were available to ancient Mesoamerican societies. Many crystal skulls entered collections through antiquities markets rather than controlled excavations. This implies broken provenance. The limitation is inability to establish reliable historical context. 19th century Europe saw increased fascination with exotic artifacts from the Americas. This cultural environment implies strong demand. The limitation is that market demand incentivized fabrication and misattribution. Museums initially accepted several crystal skulls as authentic ancient objects. This implies institutional endorsement. The limitation is that early authentication standards were limited. The British Museum and the Musée du Quai Branly each hold crystal skulls with disputed origins. This implies international distribution. The limitation is absence of excavation records linking them to ancient sites. Early accounts claimed the skulls were discovered in Central American ruins. This suggests archaeological context. The limitation is that these claims often trace back to dealers rather than archaeologists. Carving crystal requires prolonged abrasion with harder materials. This implies extensive labor. The limitation is determining whether hand tools could achieve the observed precision. Some skulls display highly symmetrical features and polished surfaces. This implies controlled mechanical processes. The limitation is that symmetry alone does not prove modern manufacture. Scientific analysis of tool marks has been central to evaluating authenticity. This implies material-based investigation. The limitation is that surface polishing can obscure tool traces. In the 20th century, advances in microscopy allowed closer examination of crystal skulls. This improved analytical capability. The limitation is that not all skulls were examined under identical conditions. Studies revealed circular tool marks consistent with rotary grinding wheels on several skulls. This implies modern techniques. The limitation is that not every skull shows identical markings. Quartz from different geological sources has distinct inclusions. This allows provenance testing. The limitation is incomplete reference databases for ancient trade routes. Chemical and structural analysis suggests some skulls were carved from Brazilian quartz. This implies post-Columbian material sourcing. The limitation is that trade routes expanded rapidly after European contact. No known pre-Columbian artwork depicts crystal skulls. This absence challenges cultural attribution. The limitation is that absence of depiction does not definitively prove non-existence. Mesoamerican skull imagery typically appears in stone reliefs and ceramics. This suggests stylistic conventions. The limitation is that crystal is a rare medium in surviving artifacts. The lack of wear consistent with ritual handling raises questions about usage. This implies limited ancient use. The limitation is that objects may have been preserved deliberately. Several crystal skulls are anatomically inaccurate in ways inconsistent with Mesoamerican artistic styles. This implies external influence. The limitation is subjectivity in stylistic comparison. Some skulls gained notoriety through association with collectors known for acquiring forged artifacts. This implies credibility concerns. The limitation is that association alone does not prove forgery. Scientific testing by the Smithsonian Institution and other bodies has concluded that several skulls are modern. This implies institutional reassessment. The limitation is that conclusions vary between specimens. Despite evidence of modern manufacture, public belief in ancient origins persists. This implies cultural attachment. The limitation is that belief does not equal evidence. Media portrayals often amplified mystical narratives around crystal skulls. This shaped perception. The limitation is distortion of scholarly findings. The persistence of disputed examples keeps the debate active. This implies unresolved cases. The limitation is uneven quality of available data. No crystal skull has been conclusively dated to a pre-Columbian context. This is a central fact. The limitation is that dating quartz directly is difficult. Authentication relies on indirect indicators such as tool marks and provenance. This implies inferential methodology. The limitation is probabilistic conclusions. Some researchers argue that a small number of skulls remain insufficiently tested. This suggests open questions. The limitation is access restrictions. The crystal skull phenomenon highlights the intersection of archaeology and the antiquities market. This implies economic influence. The limitation is disentangling commerce from culture. Scholarly consensus increasingly views most crystal skulls as 19th century creations. This reflects accumulated evidence. The limitation is that consensus allows for rare exceptions. At this contextual stage, crystal skulls are defined by disputed origins, scientific scrutiny, and missing archaeological context. The implication is unresolved authenticity, while the limitation remains clear. Without excavation evidence, certainty is constrained. Modern scientific investigations into crystal skulls focus on manufacturing techniques rather than symbolic meaning. This implies a shift from cultural interpretation to material analysis. The limitation is that technical findings cannot reconstruct the intentions behind their creation. Scanning electron microscopy has been used to examine surface striations on several skulls. This reveals tool marks consistent with rotary grinding. The limitation is that extensive polishing can obscure earlier hand tool traces. Rotary grinding wheels became common only after the Industrial Revolution. This implies modern manufacture for many skulls. The limitation is that presence of such marks does not establish an exact date. Some skulls show traces of silicon carbide abrasives. This material was not available before the late 19th century. The implication is post-Columbian production. The limitation is that contamination during later handling cannot be entirely ruled out. Researchers have compared skull anatomy to real human skulls. Several examples display inaccuracies in dental structure and cranial sutures. This implies limited anatomical knowledge. The limitation is variation exists in artistic representations. Mesoamerican artistic traditions followed symbolic conventions rather than anatomical realism. This complicates comparison. The limitation is distinguishing symbolic deviation from technical error. Tool mark orientation suggests the use of mechanized equipment capable of consistent rotation. This implies workshop conditions. The limitation is that not all skulls show identical machining patterns. Provenance research reveals many skulls passed through a small number of European dealers. This implies centralized distribution. The limitation is incomplete documentation of private sales. The antiquities market of the 19th century often lacked rigorous authentication. This allowed misattributed objects to circulate. The limitation is retrospective reconstruction of transactions. Some collectors promoted mystical narratives to increase value. This implies intentional myth-making. The limitation is separating marketing claims from original intent. Museum reevaluations in the late 20th century led to reclassification of several skulls as modern. This reflects improved standards. The limitation is uneven application across institutions. A few skulls remain inaccessible to independent testing. This limits verification. The implication is incomplete dataset. Public exhibitions often emphasize mystery over scientific findings. This shapes perception. The limitation is misalignment between scholarship and presentation. The durability of quartz means skulls can survive handling without wear. This complicates age assessment. The limitation is lack of direct dating methods. Researchers have attempted to replicate skull carving using pre-Columbian tools. This demonstrates feasibility with extreme labor investment. The limitation is that replication does not prove historical occurrence. Replication experiments require hundreds of hours of abrasion. This implies significant resource allocation. The limitation is lack of evidence for such effort in ancient contexts. No workshop sites associated with crystal skull production have been identified in Mesoamerica. This absence challenges ancient origin claims. The limitation is incomplete archaeological coverage. Chemical analysis of inclusions suggests some quartz sources were unavailable to pre-Columbian cultures. This implies later sourcing. The limitation is uncertainty about ancient trade networks. Some defenders of authenticity argue that scientific methods are biased toward modern explanations. This implies methodological debate. The limitation is that criticism does not refute empirical findings. The distinction between individual skulls is often blurred in public discourse. This leads to generalized conclusions. The limitation is that each object requires separate analysis. Academic consensus differentiates between myth and material evidence. This narrows interpretation. The limitation is allowance for rare exceptions. The crystal skull phenomenon illustrates how artifacts can acquire meanings unrelated to origin. This implies cultural layering. The limitation is disentangling layers. Claims of ancient ceremonial use lack supporting iconography. This absence weakens ritual theories. The limitation is incomplete survival of symbolic art. Museums now contextualize skulls within the history of collecting and forgery. This reframes significance. The limitation is diminished focus on original cultural narratives. Scientific testing continues to refine conclusions. This suggests progress. The limitation is diminishing likelihood of reversal. The persistence of belief in ancient origins reflects psychological appeal. This sustains public interest. The limitation is belief independent of evidence. Crystal skulls are now studied as examples of historical misattribution. This implies educational value. The limitation is disappointment for those seeking ancient mystery. The debate highlights the importance of provenance in archaeology. Without it, interpretation weakens. The limitation is irreversible loss of context. Despite extensive testing, absolute certainty remains difficult. This reflects methodological limits. The limitation is probabilistic assessment. At this investigative stage, crystal skulls are largely understood as modern creations shaped by market forces and belief, while a small margin of uncertainty persists due to incomplete access and data. The enduring fascination with crystal skulls demonstrates how objects can retain mystery even after scientific explanation. This suggests that cultural narratives often outlast empirical findings. The limitation is that fascination does not indicate unresolved authenticity. The skull's association with ancient civilizations has influenced popular media for decades. This implies narrative reinforcement. The limitation is that repetition of claims can obscure corrective evidence. Archaeology increasingly treats crystal skulls as case studies in the history of collecting. This reframes their importance. The limitation is that this perspective shifts focus away from original cultural contexts. The persistence of disputed examples highlights uneven access to scientific testing. This implies incomplete verification. The limitation is that restricted access prevents uniform conclusions. Some proponents argue that scientific tools cannot detect ancient techniques unknown to modern researchers. This implies epistemic limits. The limitation is lack of supporting evidence for such techniques. The debate illustrates how absence of context complicates authentication more than material composition. This emphasizes provenance. The limitation is that lost context cannot be reconstructed. Crystal skulls challenge assumptions about what constitutes ancient artistry. This broadens inquiry. The limitation is conflating artistic skill with chronological origin. Museums now emphasize transparency in labeling disputed artifacts. This reflects ethical responsibility. The limitation is that earlier mislabeling influenced long-term perception. The skull's role in exhibitions often balances skepticism with audience interest. This implies institutional compromise. The limitation is potential dilution of scientific clarity. Scholarly consensus does not equate to unanimity. This leaves room for debate. The limitation is that debate persists despite strong evidence. The case demonstrates how scientific reassessment can overturn long-held beliefs. This underscores methodological strength. The limitation is resistance to change in public belief. Crystal skulls remain relevant as symbols of how myths can be manufactured. This implies cautionary value. The limitation is focusing on process rather than object. The intersection of commerce and archaeology in this case reveals vulnerabilities in heritage protection. This has broader implications. The limitation is historical specificity. Modern audiences often seek mystery, even when explanations exist. This shapes reception. The limitation is preference for uncertainty. The skull's survival owes more to durability than significance. This affects interpretation. The limitation is survival bias. Continued research refines understanding, but rarely reverses conclusions. This implies stability of findings. The limitation is residual uncertainty. The case illustrates how scientific evidence can be gradual and cumulative. This shapes methodology. The limitation is lack of dramatic resolution. Crystal skulls highlight the need for critical evaluation of extraordinary claims. This informs practice. The limitation is applying skepticism consistently. The unresolved margin of uncertainty sustains discussion. This keeps the topic active. The limitation is that uncertainty is narrow. Archaeological inquiry accepts probabilistic conclusions rather than absolute proof. This defines discipline limits. The limitation is acceptance of ambiguity. The skull's history reflects shifting standards in museum practice. This informs institutional learning. The limitation is historical hindsight. The debate underscores the role of technology in correcting earlier assumptions. This suggests progress. The limitation is dependence on future tools. Crystal skulls function as artifacts of modern belief as much as material objects. This reframes meaning. The limitation is disentangling belief from evidence. The persistence of controversy reveals how knowledge is negotiated socially. This broadens analysis. The limitation is sociological inference. The case continues to be cited in discussions of forgery and authentication. This maintains relevance. The limitation is topic saturation. The inability to conclusively test every specimen leaves a residual question. This defines remaining mystery. The limitation is access constraint. Scholars agree that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This principle guides assessment. The limitation is meeting that standard. Crystal skulls remain instructive precisely because they were once believed to be ancient. This informs caution. The limitation is retrospective clarity. The phenomenon persists not because of what is known, but because of how belief endures. This explains longevity. The limitation is conflation of belief and fact. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.